The silence was wrong. In 23 years of law enforcement across 3 states, Sheriff James Morrison had never heard a jail so quiet. No coughing, no shifting of bodies on thin mattresses, no whispered conversations between cells. Just the sound of his own boots echoing through the corridors of Hollow Creek Jail, each step amplifying the unnatural stillness that had settled over Charleston's municipal prison like a burial shroud. But before we delve into the mystery that would forever change how Morrison viewed justice in the post-war South, I want to ask you to join our community of mystery enthusiasts. Subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest secrets. And I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment and let us know what city and country you're tuning in from. Your engagement helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. What Morrison was about to discover in the depths of that silent prison would reveal a conspiracy so methodical, so deeply rooted in the bitter aftermath of war, that even today, the full truth remains buried in Charleston's official records. According to the fragmented testimonies passed down through generations of local families and the scattered documents that survived the systematic destruction of evidence, the horror that unfolded at Hollow Creek Jail began 3 months before Morrison ever set foot in Charleston. In the sweltering summer of 1875, Charleston was a city caught between worlds. 10 years had passed since the Confederate surrender, yet the wounds of war still festered beneath the surface of daily life. Federal troops maintained their presence in the city, enforcing Reconstruction policies that many white residents viewed as continued occupation. The newly freed slaves, now citizens in name if not in practice, navigated a treacherous landscape where freedom meant little without protection, and protection was a luxury few could afford. Hollow Creek Jail sat on the eastern edge of Charleston's downtown district, a hulking brick structure built in 1823 that had weathered decades of use and abuse. The building's thick walls, designed to contain the city's criminals, had also served as a temporary holding facility for runaway slaves before the war. Now, in 1875, it housed a different population: petty thieves, drunks, and increasingly, freedmen arrested on charges that often seemed to materialize from thin air. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood had overseen the jail for 8 years, earning a reputation among Charleston's white establishment as a man who understood how to maintain order in turbulent times. His methods were harsh but effective, they said, and his ability to keep the peace between former slaves and their former masters had made him indispensable to city officials. When prisoners complained of mistreatment, their voices rarely reached sympathetic ears. When federal investigators occasionally inquired about conditions, Blackwood's carefully maintained records showed nothing but proper procedures and unfortunate accidents. James Morrison arrived in Charleston on August 15, 1875, carrying a letter of appointment from the state governor and a reputation for fairness that had made him unwelcome in his previous posting in Columbia. At 38, Morrison had served as a Union officer during the war, a fact that immediately marked him as an outsider in Charleston's insular law enforcement community. His appointment as Blackwood's replacement had been met with cold silence from the city council and barely concealed hostility from the jail's guards. The transition was supposed to be smooth. Blackwood would spend 2 weeks showing Morrison the ropes before retiring to his family's plantation outside the city. The prisoner population, according to the official records, stood at 27 men, housed in the jail's 16 cells. The daily routine was well established, the guard rotations carefully planned, and the paperwork meticulously maintained. But when Morrison arrived at the jail on that muggy August morning, the silence struck him immediately. Deputy Marshal William Hayes met Morrison at the jail's front entrance, his face drawn and his uniform wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. Hayes had been working under Blackwood for 6 years, and his nervous energy seemed to fill the space around him like smoke from a poorly tended fire. "Sheriff Morrison," Hayes said, extending a trembling hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." Morrison studied the deputy's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his gaze seemed to avoid direct contact. "What circumstances are those, deputy?" "The riot, sir. Started 3 nights ago. Lasted until yesterday morning. Sheriff Blackwood, well, he handled it before he left for his retirement. Everything's been settled now." The word riot hung in the air between them, but what puzzled Morrison was the complete absence of any evidence to support such a claim. No broken windows, no damaged bars, no scorch marks from fires or bloodstains on the floors. The jail looked exactly as it should, clean, orderly, and utterly silent. "How many prisoners were involved?" Morrison asked as they walked through the main corridor. "All of them, sir. Every last one. But like I said, it's been handled. They've all been transferred to other facilities for their own safety and to prevent further incidents." Morrison stopped walking. In his experience, prisoner transfers after riots were complex affairs involving multiple jurisdictions, extensive paperwork, and federal oversight, particularly when dealing with freedmen who might have been arrested under questionable circumstances. The logistics alone should have taken weeks to arrange. All 27 prisoners transferred in less than 3 days. Hayes nodded quickly, too quickly. Sheriff Blackwood had connections throughout the state. He was able to arrange emergency transfers to Columbia, Augusta, and Savannah. The paperwork is all in his office. They continued their tour through the eerily quiet cell blocks. Morrison peered through the bars of each cell, finding them not just empty, but thoroughly cleaned. The usual accumulation of personal possessions, letters, and makeshift items that prisoners inevitably collected was completely absent. Even the straw mattresses looked freshly replaced. "Where exactly did the rioting begin?" Morrison asked. Hayes gestured vaguely toward the eastern cell block. "Started in the colored section, sir. You know how they get when they're all crowded together. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, the whole place was in chaos." But as Morrison examined the colored section, he found the same pristine conditions. No damage to walls or bars, no signs of violence or struggle. The silence in this part of the jail felt particularly oppressive, as if the very air had been drained of life. That evening, Morrison sat in Blackwood's former office, studying the transfer documents Hayes had provided. The paperwork was extensive and appeared complete, but something about it bothered him. Every prisoner had been transferred on the same day, August 12th, to 3 different facilities across 2 states. The logistics of such an operation should have been nearly impossible, yet the documents made it appear routine. More troubling were the signatures. Morrison had worked with law enforcement officials throughout the region, and he recognized several of the names on the transfer orders. When he'd spoken with Sheriff Palmer in Columbia just 2 weeks earlier, there had been no mention of incoming prisoners from Charleston. In fact, Palmer had complained about overcrowding and his inability to accept transfers from other jurisdictions. As Morrison studied the documents by lamplight, a detail caught his attention that would haunt him for weeks to come. Every single transferred prisoner was listed as a freedman, arrested on charges ranging from vagrancy to theft to disturbing the peace. Not one white prisoner appeared on the transfer lists, despite the fact that Blackwood's previous reports had consistently mentioned a mixed population in the jail. The silence of Hollow Creek Jail began to feel less like peace and more like the stillness that follows a massacre. Over the following days, Morrison attempted to establish contact with the facilities that had supposedly received the transferred prisoners. His telegrams to Columbia went unanswered for 48 hours before receiving a terse reply stating that no prisoners from Charleston had been received in the past month. Savannah's response was similarly puzzling. They had no record of any transfers from Hollow Creek Jail. Augusta's reply was the most disturbing of all. The warden there, a man named Patterson, whom Morrison had known during the war, sent a personal message. "Jim, what the hell are you talking about? We haven't taken transfers from Charleston in over a year. Blackwood stopped sending prisoners here after some kind of dispute with the federal authorities. Are you sure about those dates?" Morrison found himself walking the empty corridors of the jail at odd hours, trying to understand what had happened in those 3 days before his arrival. The guards who remained from Blackwood's tenure, Hayes and 2 others named Curtis and Milner, offered consistent but vague accounts of the riot. Their stories matched too perfectly, as if they'd been rehearsed, and none of them could explain the absence of physical damage. During his second week on the job, Morrison decided to interview local residents who lived near the jail. If a riot involving 27 prisoners had occurred, surely someone in the neighborhood would have heard something. Shouting, gunfire, the sound of authorities responding to the disturbance. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, an elderly widow who lived directly across the street from the jail, received Morrison on her front porch with a cup of sweet tea and a confused expression. "A riot, Sheriff? I've been watching that jail for 15 years, and I can tell you there was no riot. Matter of fact, it's been quieter than usual this past week. Used to be I could hear the prisoners talking in the evenings, sometimes singing. Haven't heard a peep lately. Similar conversations with other neighbors yielded the same results. No one had witnessed any disturbance. No one had seen multiple prisoner transport wagons. No one had observed anything unusual except for the complete silence that had settled over the facility. The more Morrison investigated, the more convinced he became that no riot had ever occurred. But if there had been no riot, where were the 27 prisoners who should have been in his custody? And why had Blackwood felt the need to fabricate such an elaborate cover story? His answer came from an unexpected source. On a humid Thursday evening, as Morrison was locking up the jail for the night, he was approached by a young freedman named Samuel Washington. Samuel worked as a dock laborer during the day, but Morrison soon learned that his real purpose in seeking out the new sheriff was far more serious. "Sheriff Morrison," Samuel said, glancing nervously around the empty street, "I need to tell you something about my brother Marcus. He was in that jail 2 weeks ago, arrested for allegedly stealing bread from Turner's store. I've been trying to visit him ever since you took over, but your deputy keeps telling me he's been transferred. The thing is, sir, Marcus can't read or write. He would never have signed any papers for a transfer without someone explaining it to him first. And he would have gotten word to me somehow about where they were taking him." Morrison felt a chill despite the evening heat. "When exactly was your brother arrested?" "August 8th, sir. 4 days before this riot supposedly happened. He was supposed to have a hearing with Judge Crawford on August 15th, but when I went to the courthouse, they told me the case had been dismissed due to the defendant being transferred out of the jurisdiction." That night, Morrison began compiling a list of every prisoner who should have been in Hollow Creek Jail during the days leading up to his appointment. Using arrest records from the city courthouse and witness accounts from family members like Samuel Washington, he was able to confirm that at least 15 freedmen had been held in the jail during the first week of August. None of their families had received any communication about transfers. None of them had appeared at their scheduled court hearings. The silence at Hollow Creek Jail was beginning to reveal its true nature. Not the quiet of an empty building, but the stillness of a tomb. Morrison's investigation took a darker turn when he discovered that Sheriff Blackwood hadn't actually retired to his family plantation as reported. According to county records, the Blackwood family property had been sold to pay debts 3 months earlier. When Morrison visited the address listed in Blackwood's employment file, he found an abandoned house with overgrown weeds and boarded windows. More disturbing was the discovery that Blackwood had withdrawn his entire pension fund from the Charleston bank 2 days before Morrison's arrival. Nearly $800 in cash, enough to start a new life far from South Carolina. The bank manager, a nervous man named Fitzgerald, reluctantly admitted that Blackwood had seemed agitated during the transaction and had asked specific questions about train schedules to cities outside the state. "He kept looking over his shoulder," Fitzgerald recalled. "Asked me twice about the confidentiality of banking records. Not like Sheriff Blackwood at all, if you don't mind me saying. He always struck me as a man who had nothing to hide." Armed with this information, Morrison began to piece together a timeline that painted a very different picture of the events preceding his appointment. Blackwood had known for weeks that he was being replaced. He'd made financial preparations to disappear entirely from Charleston society. And sometime during the first week of August, 27 prisoners had vanished from his jail without leaving any credible paper trail. The breakthrough came when Morrison decided to conduct a thorough physical inspection of the jail, including areas that hadn't been part of his initial tour. In the basement, beneath the main cell blocks, he discovered a section of the building that didn't appear on any of the architectural plans in the city's records. The basement level contained what appeared to be older holding cells, likely dating back to the jail's original construction in 1823. These cells were smaller than those upstairs, with thicker walls and heavier iron bars that showed signs of recent use. The air down there was stifling and carried a sweet, sickly odor that Morrison couldn't immediately identify. Deputy Hayes had tried to discourage Morrison from exploring the basement, claiming it was used only for storage and was structurally unsafe. But Morrison's inspection revealed that the basement was not only structurally sound, but had been actively maintained. Fresh lime had been scattered across the floor, and several of the old cells contained items that clearly didn't belong in a storage area. Torn pieces of clothing, broken shoe leather, and what appeared to be personal effects. In the furthest cell from the basement entrance, Morrison made a discovery that confirmed his worst suspicions. Scratched into the brick wall, barely visible in the dim light from his lantern, were names and dates. Marcus Washington, Aug 8, 1875. Elijah Freeman, Aug 9, 1875. Thomas Cooper, Aug 6, 1875. The scratches were fresh, made with something sharp like a nail or piece of metal. Each name was accompanied by a date from the first 2 weeks of August. Morrison counted 17 names before the light from his lantern grew too dim to continue. What became clear to Morrison in that moment was that the prisoners hadn't been transferred anywhere. They had been moved to the basement cells, hidden from view and isolated from any possibility of outside contact. But if they were being held in the basement, why was the jail now completely silent? Why hadn't he heard any sound from below during his daily rounds? The answer to that question would prove to be the most horrifying discovery of Morrison's career in law enforcement. But as he stood in that basement cell, reading the desperate scratches left by men who had vanished without a trace, Morrison realized that he was not just investigating a crime. He was uncovering evidence of systematic murder. Will you dare to hear what Sheriff Morrison found in the deepest cells of Hollow Creek Jail? If this investigation is sending chills down your spine, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates dark mysteries. Subscribe to Dark Heritage Files for more untold stories that history tried to bury. Let's discover together what horrors were hidden beneath Charleston's most notorious jail. Morrison's hands trembled as he held the lantern closer to the wall, revealing more names scratched into the brick. Some were barely legible, carved in haste or desperation. Others were more carefully etched, as if the person had time to work slowly and deliberately. What chilled Morrison most was the progression of dates. They began on August 6th and continued through August 11th, just one day before the supposed riot. He spent 3 hours in that basement, documenting every name and date he could find. By the time he emerged, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his mind was reeling with the implications of what he'd discovered. 23 names carved into the walls of basement cells that officially didn't exist, all corresponding to freedmen who had been arrested in the days leading up to his appointment as sheriff. But the basement cells were as empty and silent as the rest of the jail. If these men had been held here, where were they now? Morrison's investigation took on a new urgency. He began working 16-hour days, poring over arrest records, interviewing family members, and mapping out a timeline of disappearances that painted a picture of systematic abduction. What he discovered was that the pattern extended beyond just the days before his arrival. Court records showed that over the past 6 months, 43 freedmen had been arrested in Charleston on various charges. Of those, only 16 had ever appeared for their scheduled court hearings. The others had simply vanished from the legal system, their cases marked as transferred or dismissed due to defendant absence. Judge Crawford, when pressed for details, claimed that Sheriff Blackwood had handled all prisoner transfers personally and that the court had relied entirely on his reports. Sheriff Blackwood was very thorough in his documentation, Judge Crawford insisted during a tense meeting in his chambers. If he said prisoners had been transferred for their own safety, I had no reason to question his judgment. The man had 8 years of experience managing that facility. But Morrison's growing collection of evidence suggested that Blackwood's transfers had been something else entirely. The timeline he was constructing showed a clear escalation in the months leading up to Morrison's appointment. What had begun as occasional disappearances had accelerated into a systematic operation that culminated in the complete emptying of the jail. The breakthrough came when Morrison decided to examine the jail's supply records. Every week, the facility ordered food, medical supplies, and other necessities based on the prisoner population. If 27 men had been held in the jail during the first week of August, the supply orders should reflect that number. What Morrison found in Blackwood's carefully maintained ledgers was a disturbing discrepancy. Food orders for the first week of August were consistent with housing 27 prisoners. But beginning on August 9th, the orders dropped dramatically. Enough food for perhaps 6 or 7 men. By August 11th, the orders had ceased entirely. Either Blackwood had been systematically starving his prisoners, or the prisoner population had been drastically reduced in ways that weren't reflected in any official documentation. Morrison's investigation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Federal Marshal Robert Clayton arrived in Charleston on a routine inspection tour, part of the ongoing federal oversight of Reconstruction-era law enforcement. Clayton was a methodical man with 15 years of experience investigating irregularities in southern jails and courts. "Sheriff Morrison," Clayton said as they sat in the jail's main office, "I've been reviewing the monthly reports that Sheriff Blackwood submitted to our office. According to his final report, filed just 2 days before his retirement, Hollow Creek Jail had successfully processed 47 prisoner transfers over the past 6 months, all without incident. He cited your jail as a model facility for prisoner management." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. "Marshal Clayton, I need to show you something." He led the federal marshal through the jail, starting with the empty cell blocks and ending in the basement. Clayton's expression grew increasingly grim as Morrison explained his findings, the scratch names, the supply record discrepancies, the families searching for missing relatives. "Sheriff Morrison," Clayton said finally, "I think we're looking at something far worse than administrative irregularities. I think we're looking at evidence of mass murder." The 2 men spent the rest of the day in the basement, carefully documenting every scratch, every mark, every piece of evidence that might help them understand what had happened to the missing prisoners. Clayton brought expertise in federal criminal investigation that Morrison lacked, and together they began to uncover a pattern that extended beyond simple murder. "Look at this," Clayton said, pointing to marks on the floor of one cell. "These scratches in the stone. They're consistent with heavy objects being dragged. And see here, where the lime has been spread most heavily. The concentration suggests they were trying to mask odors from decomposition." Morrison realized that his worst fears were being confirmed. The silence of Hollow Creek Jail wasn't just the absence of living prisoners, it was the silence that follows systematic execution. But if Blackwood had murdered 27 men in these basement cells, where were the bodies? The cells were empty. The lime suggested an attempt to manage decomposition, and yet there was no sign of mass burial on the jail property. Clayton and Morrison were looking at evidence of murder, but the victims themselves had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The answer to that question would require them to look beyond the jail itself, into the network of corruption and conspiracy that had made such atrocities possible in the Charleston of 1875. The truth began to emerge when Federal Marshal Clayton brought in a team of investigators from Columbia. Using techniques that were advanced for 1875, they conducted a systematic search of the jail property, paying particular attention to areas where the ground showed signs of recent disturbance. What they found in the small courtyard behind the jail would haunt Charleston for generations. Buried beneath 3 feet of earth and covered with lime, they discovered the remains of 19 men. The bodies were arranged in 2 mass graves, each carefully dug and methodically filled. The condition of the remains suggested they had been dead for approximately 3 weeks, placing their deaths during the first week of August, just days before Morrison's appointment. But 19 bodies couldn't account for all the missing prisoners. Clayton's investigation had identified at least 27 men who had vanished from Blackwood's custody, and the names scratched into the basement walls suggested even more victims. The breakthrough came when Clayton decided to examine the jail's relationship with other facilities in the region. Blackwood's tenure as sheriff had coincided with a period of unusual cooperation between Charleston's jail and several private facilities that housed prisoners under contract with various counties. One such facility was Riverside Work Camp, located 30 miles outside Charleston. The camp housed prisoners who were leased out to local plantations and industrial operations, providing cheap labor while generating revenue for the county. Clayton's investigation revealed that Blackwood had been sending prisoners to Riverside with unusual frequency over the past year. When Clayton and Morrison visited Riverside Work Camp, they found a facility that was essentially a privately operated death camp. Prisoners were worked 18 hours a day in brutal conditions, fed barely enough to survive, and subjected to violent punishment for the slightest infractions. The camp's records were deliberately incomplete, but what documentation existed suggested that prisoners sent from Charleston had a mortality rate approaching 50%. Camp supervisor Nathan Burke, when confronted with evidence of the irregularities, initially tried to maintain that all deaths at Riverside were due to natural causes or industrial accidents. But under sustained questioning from Clayton, Burke revealed the true nature of his arrangement with Sheriff Blackwood. "Blackwood would send us the troublemakers," Burke admitted. "The ones who were asking too many questions, demanding their rights, trying to contact lawyers or family. He'd tell us these were dangerous prisoners who needed special handling. We understood what that meant." Special handling, it turned out, meant ensuring that certain prisoners never left Riverside alive. Burke's camp was equipped with its own burial ground, hidden in a swampy area that would make the recovery of remains nearly impossible. Prisoners who arrived from Charleston under Blackwood's special arrangements were systematically worked to death or killed outright if they proved too difficult to manage. But Clayton's investigation revealed an even more horrifying truth. The arrangement between Blackwood and Burke was part of a larger conspiracy involving federal officials, local judges, and prominent Charleston businessmen. The goal was systematic elimination of freedmen who posed potential threats to the post-war power structure. "We called them the dangerous ones," Burke continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Former soldiers who knew their rights, men who could read and write and might cause trouble for their former masters. Blackwood would identify them during arrests, and we'd make sure they disappeared permanently." The 19 bodies buried behind Hollow Creek Jail represented prisoners who had been killed before they could be transferred to Riverside. According to Burke's testimony, Blackwood had become increasingly paranoid about federal oversight in the weeks before Morrison's appointment. Rather than risk sending more prisoners to the work camp, he had decided to eliminate them directly at the jail. The riot that Deputy Hayes had described was actually a 3-day massacre. Blackwood and his deputies had systematically executed prisoners in the basement cells, then spent 2 days disposing of evidence and creating false documentation to support their cover story. "He told us federal investigators were coming," Burke revealed, "said we needed to clean house completely. The basement operation was supposed to be temporary just until the heat died down. But Blackwood got scared, started killing them faster than we could process the paperwork." Clayton's federal investigation ultimately uncovered evidence of at least 63 murders committed over the course of Blackwood's 8-year tenure as sheriff. The conspiracy involved 6 other facilities across 3 states, all operating under the guise of prisoner transfer programs that were actually systematic elimination operations. The silence that had greeted Morrison when he first walked into Hollow Creek Jail was the silence of a slaughterhouse that had been hastily cleaned and abandoned by its operators. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood was never captured. Despite a federal manhunt that extended across the South and into Mexico, he vanished completely after withdrawing his pension funds from Charleston Bank. Some believed he had assumed a new identity in the frontier territories. Others suspected he had been killed by his own conspirators to prevent him from revealing the full extent of their operations. Deputy Hayes, Curtis, and Milner were arrested and tried in federal court. Hayes received a life sentence for his participation in the murders, while Curtis died in prison awaiting trial. Milner, who provided extensive testimony about the conspiracy, received 25 years in federal prison. Nathan Burke's Riverside work camp was permanently closed, and Burke himself was executed by federal authorities in 1876. The federal investigation led to the arrest of 17 other individuals, including 2 judges, a federal administrator, and several prominent businessmen who had profited from the forced labor arrangements. For Morrison, the discovery of the truth about Hollow Creek Jail marked the beginning of a crusade that would define the rest of his career. He spent the next 15 years working with federal authorities to expose similar operations throughout the South, ultimately helping to identify and prosecute corruption networks in 7 states. The families of the victims received some measure of justice, but the emotional cost was immeasurable. Samuel Washington never recovered from learning the truth about his brother Marcus's fate. He left Charleston shortly after the trials concluded and was never heard from again. The jail itself was demolished in 1878, and the property was converted into a small memorial park. But the memorial focused on victims of post-war violence, without specifically mentioning the systematic murders that had taken place there. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Charleston's white establishment was reluctant to acknowledge the full horror of what had been done in their name. Morrison kept detailed records of his investigation, but many of those documents were mysteriously lost or destroyed over the years. What remained were fragmentary testimonies, partial witness accounts, and the memories of those who had lived through the terror of Reconstruction-era Charleston. The silence that had first alerted Morrison to the truth about Hollow Creek Jail became a metaphor for the broader silence that surrounded such atrocities throughout the post-war South. How many other facilities had operated similar programs? How many other sheriffs had made arrangements with private camps to eliminate inconvenient prisoners? How many families had spent years searching for relatives who had simply vanished into the machinery of systematic murder? Morrison never found complete answers to those questions, but his investigation into the silence of Hollow Creek Jail helped expose a network of corruption and murder that had operated with impunity for years. The price of that knowledge was the understanding that the peace and order of Reconstruction-era Charleston had been built on a foundation of carefully concealed bones. In his final report to federal authorities, Morrison wrote, "The silence I encountered at Hollow Creek Jail was not the absence of sound, but the presence of death. It was the silence of men who had been systematically erased from existence, their voices silenced not just by murder, but by the deliberate destruction of any record that they had ever lived. We have recovered some of their names, some of their stories, but we must acknowledge that many more will remain forever unknown. This mystery reveals the darkest possibilities of unchecked authority and the terrible efficiency of systematic murder when it operates behind the facade of legitimate law enforcement." What do you think about this investigation into Charleston's buried history? Do you believe there were other facilities operating similar programs that were never discovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more investigations into America's hidden horrors, subscribe to Dark Heritage Files, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of remembering these forgotten victims. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but necessary journey into the past.